Good evening, everyone. We're ready to get started. A big warm welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, Stock Up, Keeping Pigs on Small Farms. Delivered to you tonight by StockSense. My name is Kimberly Henman. I'm the Project Officer with StockSense and will be chairing tonight's session. I'll be giving a quick overview of our project and then run through what the evening has to hold before we get things underway. Oh, bear with me, just struggling to change the slides. All right, so StockSense is a producer-led project that works to provide up-to-date biosecurity and animal health information to all Victorian livestock owners. It's funded through the Cattle, Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund and proudly delivered by the Victorian Farmers Federation Livestock Group. We have a range of online resources available to help with the ins and outs of owning livestock, including webinars like this, and you can keep up to date with us through social media. We also run events designed for small farm owners, bringing you face-to-face with the latest information. So be sure to keep an eye out for us. We might be coming to an area near you soon. All right, now for just a little bit of information about tonight's session. Running for about an hour, we have Dr. Trish Holyoake with us, who'll be going through the responsibilities of owning pigs, biosecurity, keeping your pigs safe, pig husbandry on a small farm, and pig health 101. I'll quickly explain how the questions side of tonight will work and then hand over to Trish. I'll draw your attention to the chat box in the corner. You'll be able to post your questions here at any time throughout the session, and we will allow breaks throughout the presentation rather than bombarding you at the end to address these questions. There is a number of you tuned in tonight, so please do bear with us. We will work to get through these questions, as many as possible within the hour. If we don't get to your questions, we will follow up questions after tonight, but also feel free to get in touch with us after the session by calling 1300 020 163 or email stocksense@vff.org.au. Now, the other final thing I have to let you know is we do have people tuning in from right across the country, so information in these presentations referring to laws and traceability requirements are relevant for those in Victoria only. If you are located in another state or territory, you will need to check with your state agricultural department. So what I'm going to do is I have got those numbers here and I'll just list them in the chat box now for you. All right. Now at the end of the survey, I did say one final thing, but there's one more. Sorry, at the end of the presentation tonight, you'll notice once you leave the room, a survey will pop up at the end of tonight's session. If you're able to, please do take part in this. All the information is private and confidential. And the main reason behind this is to help us better understand you, our audience, and tailor future sessions like this one to best suit you. It also gives you a voice in letting our funding bodies know that you find value in these sessions and would like to see more of them. So it's a very valuable tool and it would be great if you could take part. All right, so that's all from me and I will now hand over to the lovely Dr. Trish Holyoake.
Oh. Thanks, Kimberly. I don't know about the lovely bit. I think I'm just getting old. Anyway, thank you to everyone who's listening at the other end of the computer. I hope that you find the next hour of your life dedicated to this webinar a useful way to use your time. And I think that people that work with pigs or own pigs are a pretty special group. So, yeah, I hope we can all find something out from tonight. So, as Kimberly said, this presentation is divided up into 4 main sections. So the first section, which is kind of a long one, focuses on the responsibilities of owning pigs. And as Kimberly alluded to, most of the legislation is relevant to Victoria only. So I won't really be covering legislation in other states. I'll talk a little bit about marketing pig meat because that's the ultimate thing that we want to have in the forefront of our minds before we even get pigs, is to have a think about, well, what am I going to do with my pigs? Piggery planning. So pigs can be perceived as being fairly, well, obnoxious critters by some neighbours, and there are some particular council requirements about having pigs in your backyard. And then the legal obligations in a little bit more detail. So the next section will focus on biosecurity, and so I'll be talking about how to prevent diseases, local diseases coming from your neighbours, or buying in diseases probably more importantly, and keeping your pigs from getting diseases down the track, and then a little bit about some important diseases you don't want to bring into Australia, so a little bit on stool feeding in there as well. And then sort of more on the nitty-gritty about how to look after your pigs, some of the basics about what pigs require, and so housing pigs, feed and water requirements. And given I'm a veterinarian, I'll try and dedicate some time to some important economic diseases that will you really want to avoid. So the last section we'll talk about my comfort zone, which is pig health. So we'll get started into some of those sections. So the first section, responsibilities of owning pigs. So, and as I said earlier, you really need to think about what am I going to do with my pigs, even before you get pigs. So you'll know that one sow will have, anything from maybe 15 piglets down to, sort of 8 piglets per litre, and they'll breed probably twice a year. So if you're going to be growing your pigs out, and most people tend to have their pigs grown out a live weight of sort of 80, 90 kilos, if you're sort of doing it more for a hobby than anything. So you're talking about maybe 60 kilo carcass weight. So if you're talking about maybe 20 pigs per sow per year times 60 kilos, that's an awful lot of pig meat that you're going to have to try and eat yourself, unless you have a plan B on what to do with all the other kilos. So, I mean, your friends and neighbours might help, but there are some pretty important rules you need to know around farm kills, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some people, you might be able to sell your pigs. You might sell them as weaner pigs, and most people, particularly people that rear pigs outdoors, will grow their pigs out at about 6 weeks of age and then wean them. So you might look to sell your weaners to somebody to grow out. So, there's private players. Some people might find that there's a niche breed of pigs that they enjoy, and there might be other people that are interested in buying those breeds of pigs. And of course there are butchers and wholesalers, but just remember that a lot of butchers will particularly they may want certain cuts of pork, and I mean, if we're getting down that list a little bit further, you're talking about restaurants. A restaurant might pay you, I don't know, $20, $25 a kilo for pork belly, but they may not necessarily want the rest of the carcass. So you really need to think about, well, what am I going to do with the pig meat that I'm producing, and if I can find a home for part of the pig, what will I do with the rest of the pigs? Abattoirs, and I mean, I guess one of the tricky things about pigs is that the abattoirs that service the pig industry are kind of a contracting population as well. So there are, I mean, if you're talking about Victoria, there are probably 2 major abattoirs now down here in Melbourne. We have had recent closures of domestic abattoirs in the last sort of 5 years. And so it's important that you have an abattoir in mind that would be able to process the pigs that you produce. I've touched on restaurants a little bit. Markets, again, if you're thinking about farmers markets, you need to contact your council. You'll find that some markets or some councils will only allow one particular, say if you're a pork producer, there might only be allowed to be one pork producer at the market. So if that person is already at the market, it will be flooded, so you can't necessarily set up there. And there's also requirements, legal requirements around producing and selling meat at farmers markets. And the last one is sale yards. Again, they are a contracting group. There used to be lots of sale yards around that might sell the odd pig, and certainly there were pig dedicated sale yards. So there's probably 3 or 4 large sale yards that still sell pigs around the country, but I don't know if I would be relying on sale yards as my outlet to sell my pigs. So you really need to think long and hard about what you're going to do with your pigs before you even get them. So one of the points I touched on was if you're going to grow your own pigs and you're going to decide to kill your pigs, and you might have friends and family that will help out in terms of eating the meat, there are some important rules that you need to, or laws that you need to be aware of. So certainly if you are going to kill a pig as a home kill, you need to make sure that you've been appropriately trained to kill a pig. And so that training should be documented. The important thing about home kills is that meat can't leave the property. So, you know, if you are going to do a home kill, then, you know, it's got to stay on your farm. You can process that meat into small goods, but the same rule applies that the small goods cannot leave the property. The other important thing is that you also have to be designated as a farm to do a home kill. And as Kimberly touched on earlier, this legislation is Victorian legislation. So if you're from other states, you're going to have to look up your own legislation. And to be a farm, you in Victoria, you need to be at least 32 kilometres from the GPO in Melbourne. You need to have at least 2 hectares of land, and that land has to be zoned for agricultural pastoral purposes. If you're not a farm and you want to have pigs and you want to have your pigs slaughtered, you must have your pigs killed at a licensed premises, in other words, an abattoir or at a rendering facility. So you cannot have your pigs killed any other way. If you're talking about using farmers markets as an outlet for your pork, you need to have those pigs slaughtered again at a licensed facility. That facility's identification has to be put on the product that you're selling to the farmers market. You can transport the products to the market for sale, but again, the councils are going to have oversight of that. And again, as part of the laws requirement under the food authorities, if you want to sell the leftovers later, again, you must have a license to store and sell that meat. So if you're going to get into this sort of area, just be very aware of the legislation required within your council and within the state. The second part of this whole legislation area is really looking at what is required in terms of having a pig on your property. And up here I've put the basic requirements for having a pig. So, and again, this is Victorian focused, so I guess I apologise to people that aren't in Victoria. But if you have a pig, you have to have a permit. So there are 2 permit requirements. There's a simplified application, which is the smaller farm, and so in the left-hand side of that screen, there's a mention about STU. So that's basically an easy definition is well, 1 grower pig would be 1 STU. So you can see there for yourself that if you are a farmer who has less than 150 sows, you have your pigs kept outdoors in paddocks, you have less or equal to 12 STUs per hectare, you need to be able to shift the infrastructure where you house your pigs. So you might be aware that even if you had a 100-hectare paddock, if you had the pigs in that paddock, the pigs will tend to stay around the area where the shelter, the feed and the water is. So they're not going to move all around that paddock. They're going to stay sort of in a triangle between the shelter, food and water, and that's where the effluent is generally going to build up. So you need to be able to move that infrastructure around, and the council requirement is at least every 3 months. The other point that's important is that pigs are terribly destructive in terms of removing any ground cover that you have. And so you need to maintain a requirement of at least 50% ground cover. That's to minimise the loss of the surface ground and just make sure that you've got good coverage. And that there are requirements around how close pigs can be to other residential buildings and sensitive areas. So every other larger pig farm, there's a standard application process. So again, I'd refer you to that planning.vic.gov.au website, and I've also included the different zones where you can or can't keep pigs. And it's important that you set this up correctly before you get your pigs, because the last thing you want is fill your backyard up with pigs and have your neighbour complain. So there's some really good references that, and again, if you're going to get pigs, I'd strongly recommend that you just look up the Australian Pork Limited website, familiarise yourself with APL. They are the national body for the pig industry of Australia. They're based in Canberra, but they have some excellent publications that you can use, not only for planning where and how you're going to grow your pigs, but also there's a lot of information around training requirements and certainly more detailed information once you get your pigs, how to look after them. So, and you can also become a member of Australian Pork Limited. So it's worthwhile just having a look at what resources are available to you from them. Then if you're going to think about, well, what will I do in terms of rearing my pigs? I don't know who's on the other end of this computer, but I'm assuming that, given we're talking about small farms, that most people would have small numbers of pigs and will probably be growing them outdoors. But I think it's just important to highlight that the reason that a lot of people grow their pigs indoors is that feed is one of your major costs of production. So feed is generally around sort of 60 to 80% of your production costs. And certainly if you're growing your pigs indoors, because you have better control of their environment, it's going to be a lot easier for you to maintain those pigs in their comfortable zone of temperature, and that they therefore would have improved feed conversion efficiency. So, and feed conversion efficiency is basically defined as the kilograms of feed required to produce a kilogram of meat, and that can be expressed in various ways. But so if you're growing pigs outdoors, just be aware that you're going to require more feed than if you're going to be growing the pigs indoors. And just a little bit of a comparison, there's some data on how much feed is required in terms of tonnes for outdoor versus indoor farms. An average feed cost, and this feed cost is, I guess, kind of conservative at the moment, and we're seeing that feed is probably currently the most expensive it's ever been. So you can certainly see that there is a difference in rearing your pigs indoors or versus outdoors in terms of the biggest cost, which will be your feed. I guess, why have the pigs outdoors? There's certainly some advantages in terms of setting up the costs or setting up your farm. So, I mean, there will still be significant costs, and we'll talk more about the requirements for housing pigs, but you will need to have good fences. Ideally, they'd be electrified. Ideally, you'd have reticulated water so that your pigs could have water in all the paddocks that you house them in. But certainly there is an increasing awareness among the community on the welfare side of things, and there's an increase in market pressure to rear pigs, I guess, in a more natural environment, and the outdoor rearing system would be deemed as perhaps more natural to to most consumers. So, so there certainly is an increasing demand for having pigs reared outdoors. So you may find more niche markets if you're going to rear pigs outdoors. I guess the other part of that is if you have other farming types, so if you have crops or if you have other animal species, pigs can be a fairly handy source of fertiliser for you. But, you know, again, I would certainly be referring to some of those resources like the APL environmental guidelines, or have a good agronomist to talk to. I mean, ideally you'd be doing things like measuring some of the key components like nitrogen and phosphorus within the soils before you even get your pigs, and just keep monitoring those elements every sort of 12 months or so to make sure that you're not over nutrifying your ground. I guess some of the other advantages of indoor housing is certainly your breeding efficiencies will be improved, and if you're aware, pigs are actually seasonal breeders, so they're not really designed to be getting pregnant around. The easy way to remember that is between Christmas and Easter, so the first 16 weeks or so of the year. So if you have pigs outdoors, they're less likely to be able to breed than if you have them indoors. A lot of that is driven by day length. So obviously if you've got pigs indoors, well then they will have less exposure, I guess, to the changes in day length. And as I alluded to before, if pigs are indoors, you'll have better control of their environment. Pigs are very susceptible to overheating, particularly adult pigs. You probably know that pigs have very poorly developed sweat glands, so they're unable to cool themselves down except by panting, or if you provide them with some sort of cooling, whether that be through surface water and evaporation from their skin. But you certainly need to ensure that if you have pigs outdoors that you have some way for them to cool themselves. So part of the piggery planning, you need to consider how much space you have, and again that, well, I guess the DSC equivalent. So like I said, one porker is 1 DSC, adult pigs are around 3 DSCs. And as I mentioned, you should rotate your pasture when you've got, you know, 50% ground cover still there. Think about the rainfall in your region. You can see from that paddock there that certainly there's really no ground cover left where the pigs have been housed, and it's basically a boggy nest. So, you know, ideally you would need to, from a welfare perspective, that's not a great thing. Pigs need to have enough clean, relatively clean, dry area for them all to camp, and certainly that sort of paddock in the photo wouldn't be meeting that requirement. And the other thing, as I mentioned, pigs are very susceptible to heat stress. So if you are living in an area that has, you know, very extreme summer temperatures, I'd be really thinking twice about getting pigs and housing them outdoors. And you can see from that picture that's a little white pig that's been sunburnt. I mean, coloured pigs are still prone to getting sunburnt. It's just that they're less prone to getting sunburnt. So just because you've got Berkshire or large black pigs, just don't think that they're not going to get sunburnt. So, but yeah, certainly white pigs aren't as suited to being outdoors as the coloured pigs are. But they'll all get sunburnt if they don't have any shade. And also pigs do tend to be a bit silly sometimes, and even they will lie out in the sun when they shouldn't, and like little kids to get sunburnt. So some of the other nitty-gritty type things around legal obligations. So you need to make sure that you have a property identification code, a registered pig tattoo and/or ear tags, and you need to register with PigPass, know what swill feeding is, and make sure that you're competent to rear pigs. So I'll just go through all of those dot points one by one. So a property identification code really links the livestock on your property to you as the owner and to the address where the pigs are kept. And again, that varies a little bit with the state that you live in. I've just put up on the screen here a copy of the screen that you'll see if you register for property identification code in Victoria. It's no cost to do that. In Victoria, that is run through Digita. So it's a pretty easy thing to do, and anyone that owns a pig should have a property ID code. The other part of that is having some way to track the pigs that move from your farm or from your property. And again, the legislation is going to vary among the different states, but certainly you do need to identify your pigs when they leave your property. And that's really to so that the regulators are able to track pig movements in the case of an exotic animal disease or an emergency animal disease occurring in the country, or if there's a contamination issue and the product recall is required. So in Victoria, there's a requirement if your pigs are over 25 kilograms live weight that you have a body tattoo. So that tattoo will be assigned to you. So once you have a property ID code, you apply for a body tattoo, a tattoo number, again through Digita, and you'll have the tattoo made up for you by someone like Vaucluse or one of the other private tattoo manufacturers. But so in Victoria, it's the number 3 and then 3 letters after the number, and the body tattoos, it should be placed on the left shoulder. For little pigs under 25 kilos in Victoria, there is a requirement that all pigs have an ear tag, and that ear tag has the same number as the body tattoo has. So fairly simple. The other requirement is now that it's mandatory for anyone if you've got one pig, as is said on the screen, or if you have 20 pigs, you need to register with Australian Pork Limited for a pig pass. So one of the things that you'll need to do before you go onto that pig pass site or you phone the pig pass help desk is make sure you do have a property ID code and you do have a tattoo, because they're 2 requirements you'll need to fill out for your pig pass form. The only time where you wouldn't need to complete pig pass form is if you are moving pigs, if you're not actually selling pigs, if they're moving within the properties that you own. So that's one thing to remember as well. And I mean, this is an old version of the pig pass form, but basically there are options, and you need to talk to the APL staff about this, but there are electronic versions of the pig pass form that you can look at, or you can just purchase a pig pass book and just fill out those forms manually. So there's a section asking about your details, so certainly the number of pigs, the gender of the pigs, the description. There might be, are they bacon pigs? Is it a cull sow? Special notes. You might have, say, animals that are a little bit compromised, or occasionally you might get a needle stuck in a pig. So you would need to list in there the identity of the pig that has that issue and just note down what the concern is. And then there's certainly information about whether the pigs have been treated with anything, if they're still on a withholding period, so you're minimising the risk of any violative residues occurring in the pigs. This part C is very important, and it is similar to a stat deck, where you need to basically say that you understand the notes within the pig pass, and that you haven't fed swill to your pigs, and that they're fit to travel. So The swill component, and swill I guess is the common term that people think about, but I guess the new name for swill is prohibited pig feed. Within the last sort of 1 to 2 years, Australia developed a common definition for swill. Previously it varied among the different states. So it's important that you're aware of this definition. So basically pigs, anything that's of mammalian origin or anything that's come in contact with mammalian origin material should not be fed to pigs. So meat or meat products. So if you're talking about, the common thing is some people might feed their pigs bakery waste, but certainly if it's got, if it's a ham and cheese roll, you can't feed, or bacon roll, you can't feed that to your pigs. And certainly you are not allowed to let pigs graze on other dead livestock on your property, because that's considered as swill feeding as well. And finally, in terms of this section on responsibilities, the really important point is, are you competent to care for pigs? So when the welfare code was revised back in 2007, I think, one of the requirements was that anyone that owned a pig needed to be competent to care for them, or they needed to work under the supervision of someone who was. So, and there are specific requirements in terms of what competency is. So things like, are you able to identify whether pigs are sick or not sick? Are you able to treat pigs? Are you able to euthanize pigs if required? So it's important that you have a look at the welfare code and that you're aware of whether, what those requirements are for competency. So we're up to the end of the section now, and I've got a little break here for questions. So I can see a question here. Trish, how would they do a recall once a carcass is broken up? Good question. I mean, it would be really difficult. I'm not sure if I would know how they would do that. So if you've got an animal that has a body tattoo on it, the best you could do is know that that meat has, where that meat has come from. But in terms of tracking where all the bits and pieces have come from, that would be a really hard one. I'm not sure. I'm not answering that question very well. Sorry. And I've got, so pigs. Okay. Okay, so Katie's asked another question, so this one I might be better at answering. Where is the competency skill set done now? Well, I know in Victoria, GoTAFE, based in Shepparton, has an agreement with the Victorian department here in Bendigo, the Pig Services Unit, and they are now offering to provide basic competency set training. So I would contact either GoTAFE, and the person there is a guy called James Golding, or you could talk to the Pig Services Centre and just register that you're interested in doing the training. Okay, so Kimberly's moving me on. I've talked too much. So sorry, the next section is on biosecurity. So the way that I've written this is to think about first, well, what are the ways that pigs get diseases? And 99% of pig diseases come in with an infected pig. So the other 1%ers are aerosol. So obviously respiratory diseases are more likely to be transmitted through aerosol. Humans have been known to transmit diseases, but there's really very few diseases that humans are actually going to bring into your farm, with the exception of influenza, which we'll touch on in a minute. It's more the clothes that the humans are wearing. So if you've been to, probably the most risky scenario is if you've taken your pigs to the abattoir and you walked around the lairage area with your boots on, and then you take those boots and walk around your own pigs. So most of the things that you transmit are going to be on your dirty clothes back to your pigs. And then there's a few diseases that other animals can transmit to your pigs. So I guess the first thing is, if you're going to get pigs, just make sure that the pigs don't have the diseases that you don't want. And I'll touch on the key ones at the end of the talk. But so, you know, talk to the person that owns the pigs, ask them questions about, well, do they know what diseases their pigs have? What are they vaccinating them against? Do they have a valid vet-client relationship? So do they have a vet that they talk to if they get a sick pig? Have they had any diagnostic work done, that kind of thing? Minimise the number of people that you buy your pigs from. So ideally, just have one supplier. I guess another way to bring in new genetics without bringing in new live pigs is through semen and doing your own artificial insemination, which is actually really pretty easy. Don't buy pigs at auction. I think that's the biggest trap that people do, is they go to sale yards and they buy pigs, and then they have no idea what diseases that they're buying in. Even the smallest property can still set up a little quarantine area before you bring your pigs, your newly purchased pigs, to mix with your own pigs. Ideally have a section where your new purchased pigs are kept for a while away from your own pigs. Once you've brought those pigs, your new pigs, in with your existing pigs, if the wheels fall off and they all get sick, well, there's no comeback. But at least if you've got a quarantine area, you've got a bit of time. If whoever's selling you the pigs finds out they actually have a really nasty disease, then you can offload the pigs that you've bought and you haven't damaged your own pig's health status. It's important to know who's visiting your farm and minimise, if you can, the number of people that go visit your pigs, because basically you don't want them bringing diseases in. And I would always provide site-specific boots and overalls. So even if they're just boot covers and disposable overalls, but just something so that you've got some way of controlling what bugs your own pigs are likely to be exposed to from the visitors. In terms of quarantine, the ideal quarantine would be to have your pigs separate for at least 6 weeks. Most diseases that pigs commonly get have an incubation period of shorter than 6 weeks, so they will express those diseases in that time. If you're reading the textbooks, it would say that you should have your quarantine area at least 3 kilometres away from your own pigs, and that is mainly because of a disease called mycoplasma pneumonia, which can blow about 3 kilometres, and it may possibly blow more, but 3 kilometres will be a relatively safe distance. Use sentinel pigs, and by that I mean have some of your own pigs. So you might have some bacon pigs that you're looking to sell, and you might house them with these newly purchased pigs during that 6 weeks. And that way, you know, if your pigs get sick, that there's something wrong with the ones that you've just bought. And other way around, if you newly purchased pigs get sick, at least that way you'll know that they're a bit more naive than the pigs you have. And it's important that you know, you vaccinate and worm those pigs before they enter your farm. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. Pigs are notoriously destructive, so it's important that you do have good fencing, and ideally that the fencing's electrified, or else your pigs are just going to be all over the place and you'll have no control over where they are. I mentioned providing farm-specific boots and overalls, and that's really to minimise the risk that anyone that's coming onto your farm is going to bring new diseases onto the property. I think one really important thing to remember is that when we had the H1N1 influenza outbreak back in 2011 in humans, that a number of pig farms were infected from the sick humans. So, and the tough thing about influenza is you're most infectious when you're incubating the disease, when you don't actually know you have it. but still, just be aware that you can transmit influenza to pigs, and pigs are actually known as a bit of a mixing vessel, so that you can get changes in the virus once they enter the pig. So it's an important one to be aware of. So I'd recommend, if you're going to have pigs, to get an annual influenza vaccination. It's not going to be 100% protective, but at least it's better than nothing. And for pigs, if they do get influenza, the clinical signs are similar to what you'll see in humans. So they'll be generally lethargic off their feed, they'll have a high temperature, they'll do a bit of coughing, and yeah, they won't feel well, but after a time they'll get over it. But it's certainly something that can reoccur seasonally in your pigs, so maybe one to try and aim to keep out. If you've got other critters on your property, just be aware of some legal things. So most pig feed will contain meat meal or food type substances, and so if you can't legally allow ruminants to eat that sort of food. So just be aware of that if you're housing ruminants with your pigs. We've mentioned school feeding before. Erysipelas is a disease that's transmitted from, well, sheep and turkeys can also get erysipelas as well as pigs, so take care of that. And I've mentioned influenza already. And again, this is, so we've got a little picture of an alpaca there. On this farm, they were using alpacas to keep the foxes away from attacking the baby piglets, which worked really well. But again, just be aware that you cannot let those alpacas have access to the pig's feed if it contains meat meal. Really important part of this whole talk is making sure that we're not introducing any diseases from overseas into our pigs. We're not allowed to import any pig products, no semen, embryos, anything like that into Australia. One of the ways, if we're going to get one of these foreign diseases in, would be through the illegal importation of pig products. And the key one that we really need to be aware of is foot and mouth disease. The outbreak of FMD in the UK in 2001 was introduced through illegal school feeding of pigs, and you know, there was basically you know, millions of animals slaughtered to eradicate that disease. More than $1 billion was spent, and the side effect of that was certainly businesses going out of, not continuing. Tourism took a big hit, and yeah, this is all through school feeding of pigs. So we have previously had foot and mouth disease in the country, not for over 100, not within the last 130 years. Pigs are a major risk factor, mainly through school feeding, but they also are amplifiers of the virus, so they do excrete a lot more virus than other ruminant species, and the virus does survive for a long period of time inside pig meat products. So it's important to be aware of that. I've mentioned African swine fever in this talk because if you've got pigs, you will have been under a rock in the last few months if you haven't heard about this. But China and Belgium have recently had bad outbreaks of African swine fever. China in particular, started in August of this year. And it's a moving feast in terms of what impact it's had on the industry. A really difficult industry to try and control because there are a really large number of backyard producers, and there's also a large wild boar population in China. So I mean, not dissimilar to, I guess, the Australian situation where we do have, 25 million odd wild pigs in this country, and a lot of people have, pigs in their backyard. So this strain of African swine fever is pretty much identical to the strain that's in Russia, and it's been thought that it was introduced into China through the illegal feeding or through feeding of pigs with contaminated pork products. The thing about African swine fever is it can look very similar to a lot of other diseases that cause just a general septicemia or blood poisoning. So basically the pigs are very lethargic. They very high temperature, their extremities go red, and so that could look very much like a bad case of erysipelas. So if you do see anything suspicious or unusual, make sure that you call your vet or the emergency animal disease hotline. In China, what impact has this disease had? Well, there's no treatment for African swine fever. Generally, pigs get infected, die. There are no commercially available vaccines. The authorities have, if there's a farm detected with swine fever, the pigs are all slaughtered, and there's certainly an increased restriction in what you can feed to your pigs in China and movement of pigs around. And there have been recently some large farms in China identified with African swine fever, so it's not just smallholder farms that have been affected. So, and certainly we don't want to be introducing that kind of disease. So I guess if you do see anything that looks unusual, so it might be unusual clinical signs, it might be an unusually high number of sick or dead animals. If you see any pig ever with blisters on its snout or on its feet, or if you see lameness, which is what you'll tend to see more commonly in something like foot and mouth disease virus, talk to your veterinarian or call the emergency animal disease watch hotline. And that's a good number just to put in your mobile phone just for a day-to-day thing. So I'll just keep going because I've just gone way over time and poor Kimberly's having a heart attack here. So we'll talk about husbandry quickly. So first of all, when you look to buy your pigs, you want to make sure that you get the breed that is suitable for yourself. You need to make sure that the health of the pigs is good and that you're able to get help from whoever sells you the pig. So what breed are you going to use? Well, if you're going outdoors, you may want a white breed, but I would strongly recommend you get a bit of colour in there as well. I've got there the two common white commercial breeds that are used in Australia. So spot the difference. Well, you may see this kind of easily, or it might be a fun one. But anyway, large white pigs have ears that stick up. Landrace pigs have ears that flop down. And if you're looking at the black and white belted breeds, and it's a similar thing with the Hampshire and the Wessex Saddleback. So the Hampshire's got a erect ears and the Wessex Saddleback's got floppy ears. The white breeds are commonly used in the commercial setting because they're mainly the improved genotype. They grow fast, they leaner type breeds. They have really good feed conversion efficiency. Whereas some of these other breeds like the Wessex Saddleback and some of the other ones like the Berkshire and the large black, I guess more traditional older breeds of pigs. They have more intramuscular fat. They certainly taste terrific, but you will find that they're slower to grow and they'll have poorer feed efficiency. But the taste all comes from that intramuscular fat. And even the little old Tamworth, terrific mothers, really hardy little breed of pig, and so that might be another one to think about. And there's very declining number of Tamworths in Australia, so if you're into heritage breeding, well, maybe the Tamworth's the one for you. So just quickly looking at the life cycle of the pig. So generally, if you wean a sow, she'll come back on heat within 5 to 7 days. If she gets pregnant, she'll have a gestation period of 16 weeks, or the easy way to remember that is 3 months, 3 weeks and 3 days. Most commercial farmers will wean their pigs at about 3 to 4 weeks of age. People that grow pigs outdoors, it's usually more like 6 to 8 weeks of age, just so that pigs have got a bit more weight and they're a bit more hardy to survive being outdoors. And then depending on what breed you have, generally a weaner will be sort of up to about 10 weeks of age, a grower pig up to about 16, and a finisher. Most commercial people will sell their pigs at around 20 to 24 weeks of age. They'll start sort of pulling them out as the really heavy ones at about sort of 16, 18 weeks of age. So it just depends what your market is. In terms of housing pigs, you need to make sure that you have some shelter so that the pigs can get out of the elements, and particularly shade is important for pigs. So I've just got up here some pictures of various different designs of shelters. So here we've got a little shelter for sows and piglets. There's an eco shelter there for dry sows. There's a little farrowing hut there in a paddock. And this photo on the corner here shows a lady that used to have ponies, but she kicked the ponies out and put the pigs in the stable. So really important that you have some decent facilities if ever you want to do anything with your pigs. I mean, this might be for trimming boars, tusks, or preg testing sows, or giving them vaccinations, but you need to have somewhere that's hardy to house your pigs when you want to do some sort of intervention with them. Remember that pigs are monogastric, so they aren't able to really utilise grasses as well as sheep and cattle. You will need to provide them with some sort of supplementary feed, and you know, you might look at making your own feed for your pigs. Remember that the feed that they use will be more efficiently digested if the grain's crushed. If it just is fed whole, it's going to go straight through the pig. Beware of contamination. So I'm thinking about moulds or, you know, weevils and that kind of thing. Or it's just as easy just to buy commercially made feed. Remember that pigs aren't great at utilising pasture. There have been a number of different deficiencies reported in pigs that are just allowed to graze on forage. So vitamin A deficiency, particularly in summer, pantothenic acid or a type of vitamin B deficiency causes nervous signs and calcium issues with rickets. So, and just be aware that if you, the pigs will eat you, I guess, basically. So just be careful around your pigs. Always make sure that, you know, you've got a way out so that you don't end up being consumed yourself. Water is critical for pigs, not only for drinking but also for cooling, and it's important that the quality of the water's good for them. You don't want them to end up with salt poisoning. Blue-green algae can cause death and nervous signs, and you can get diarrhea from particularly dam water that is contaminated. Cooling pigs, you need to think about how you're going to do that. Will you have some wallows in the paddock? Often pigs will tip the water out from the drinkers anyway and make their own wallow, or you might do like this little farm and have a spray device for the pigs to wallow in. But certainly you need to have some cooling, and just be aware of blue-green algae where you've got warm surface water. And in the last couple of minutes, we're going to touch on pig diseases. So one of the really important things is, do you have a vet that you can talk to regularly if your pigs get sick? So you can't just, if your pigs get sick, you can't just ring up a vet and say, can you give me some antibiotics over the phone, because legally a vet can't do that. You have to have some knowledge of the pigs that you're seeing and be able to diagnose what diseases they have. I've already mentioned don't buy pigs in if they have diseases. Quarantining. Make sure that you look at your pigs every day. That's a requirement of the welfare code. Know what normal looks like. Have a vet and have a herd health program. The significant diseases that you really don't want, swine dysentery is probably the major one. Causes a mucohemorrhagic diarrhea, and pneumonias. There's some major pneumonias. Mycoplasma high pneumonia is the one that will blow the 3 kilometres. Other ones like Pasteurella and pleuropneumonia. This pig was actually dying of pleuropneumonia with the open mouth breathing. But again, the key is not buying pigs that have these diseases subclinically. Some of the other things you might think about, external parasites, so mange and lice are quite common, particularly in outdoor pigs, and they will cause significant carcass damage with the dermatitis that the pigs get in response to the biting, which might result in having your pig scum. So, and then you think about worms, and these are roundworms or ascid worms. in the small intestine of the pig, the larvae in those worms move through the liver and cause damage. So important that you don't buy these diseases in, that you talk to your vet about vaccination programs, worming, and what sort of routine medications that you need. I've put up here just an example vaccination program. So the main diseases that you want to vaccinate your breeding stock against are leptospirosis, erysipelas and parvovirus, because they can cause reproductive failure. And for your parasites, I guess the main thing is know what you've got. Make sure that you are cleaning up your feces in your yards, that you're rotating your pigs around. You can do things like fecal egg counts, like you do for your sheep, to monitor that what worms you have and how much is there. Whatever you use, make sure that it's registered for use in food producing animals to try and control whatever you've got. And certainly, in terms of health concerns, always consult your veterinarian. The person who sold you the pigs can be helpful too. I mean, they might be your first port of call, and then you've got these other agencies that you can talk to that would be able to help. I've just put this little slide up just so that you're aware. I do have a little Facebook site. I'm not very good at looking at it regularly, but there's a little bit of information up there that you might find interesting. And I must apologise to everyone and to poor Kimberly here that I've talked too much, and I've had to rush the last little section of the talk. So, okay, so Darren's asked a question about what age should male pigs be marked. Well, legally, you can't castrate a pig yourself over 21 days of age. I would recommend the best age to do it is around about 5 to 7 days. If you do it too little, well, then you'll upset these little pigs' spot at the milk bar, and if you do it too late, they're too big and heavy. So I say about 5 to 7 days is a good age to be castrating pigs. And other questions. Oh, Pinna is the ears. Oh, sorry, Katie's already asked about that. Signs of vitamin A deficiency, mainly nervous signs. So you will, but you can see sort of swaying of the hindquarters of the pig. And in breeding animals, you can get pigs that are born blind if the breeding stock have been vitamin A deficiency during their pregnancy. So, okay, how to replace heat lamps in outdoor shelters. Outdoor shelters, most outdoor people that have farrowing huts outdoors don't tend to use electrical heater lamps. Most people will just rely on having an insulated farrowing hut and having straw inside them and letting the animals sort of regulate their own little temperature, and so that you know, you don't get issues that way. And Janine's asking, can you confirm that small farms need a planning permit or streamlined permit, even if they've been operating without them for a number of years? It's a good question. I think I'd be consulting my council, my own council, about that question. Certainly when I visited the Bendigo Council to ask them what their regulations were, they told me that they didn't get many requests or many questions about having pigs, but I would talk to your council just because you want to make sure that you know, if you do have complaints from the neighbours, that you're covered. Okay, so I will hand over to Kimberly. Thank you again, everyone, for listening, and I hope you've gotten something out of tonight's talk.
Thank you for that, Trish. Very sorry, I know there is a couple of questions left, but we are quickly running out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you to you all for taking the time, and thank you to Trish for sharing that wealth of knowledge with us. Trish did give us some great take-home messages tonight, and it was a lot to take in, so we will be sending through a recording of the session so you can listen again and pick up on all of her great tips. If you didn't get your questions answered, I do apologise. Please feel free to send through any follow-up questions to stocksense@vff.org.au or call us on 1300 020 163, or Trish had her contact details up there, which was 0427 302754, or you can shoot her an email at trishpigvet@bigpond.com. Now, as just a quick reminder, once we do finish up tonight, there will be a survey at the end of your screen. This is your opportunity to have your voice and tell us what you enjoyed about tonight. And yeah, we really would appreciate that feedback to you. It is all anonymous. Thank you again for your great participation. It was wonderful to have that sort of communication with you guys. I'd like to thank Trish again for taking the time to share with us. And a final thank you to my fellow team members who worked behind the scenes to help pull this together. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you've got any other questions. But for now, that's a wrap from us, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.